What's up, comrades, and welcome to the series finale of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. You've probably been wondering where we are. Well, the short answer is after much contemplation of retreating to a mountain far away, sitting in a cave, contemplating on the vastness of interstellar space, yours truly, Chairman Bain, decided in a very bittersweet fashion that it was time to end the show. 3 years ago, we started Red Library as a way to talk about books, to model a way to read and discuss theory together, and I think we've done just that. Everything that the show has stood for, everything that we've tried to do is in there. It's in the episodes going back all the way to the very first one on Vijay Prashad's Arab Spring, Libyan Winter. What better way to wrap up the show than with the most galaxy-brained, esoteric, and complex book that we've ever tackled. We're going to be doing a 3-part series on Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition by Glenn Alexander Magee, and who better to call in for backup for dialectical pessimist reinforcements than our most amazing comrades going all the way back to the OG days, the Regrettable Century. And as we just wrapped up the Enchantments of Mammon series not that long ago, I can really think of no better way to end Red Library's run on a book just like this. Now, if you're one of the patrons, you've already heard some of this before, but just in case you're feeling big sad about Red Library and Chairman Bain going away forever, going gently into that good night, fear not, fearless listeners, because there is talk of a new show being reborn from the ashes of the old, which may be back sometime later this year. So keep your eyes and ears peeled, keep your third eyes peeled on the RL feed, because if and when yours truly does come back and decides it's time to go mobile once again, you're gonna hear it first on the RL feed. Enjoy this wild-ass ride on Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, and keep your ears peeled for the very end of part 3 as we go out on a few final comments and big thank yous to all of our listeners out there all across the globe, all of our comrades who have stuck with us through the last 3 years. We greatly appreciate y'all. You've made this show really worth it, more than anything else at the end. In the meantime, enjoy some alchemical mystery school teachings by way of the big galaxy brain theory daddy himself, Hegel.
Gathered here today to discuss Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition by Glenn Alexander Magee. And we've got a full house of podcasting dignitaries. Adam from Red Library. Say what's up, Adam.
What's up, y'all? Chairman Bain in the house for our last Red Library episodes. Happy to be here doing this esoteric shit.
Mir.
Your comrades in Christ are ready to burn the heretics.
And then all these fucking assholes from the Regrettable Century. Say what's up,
This is
guys.
Kevin.
This is Jason. Hi.
Hi, I'm Jess.
So we've been trying to understand Hegel unsuccessfully for quite some time now.
Yeah.
And we actually think that this might be helpful. Because
I think so.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're only, a little less than halfway through the book so far, but it's helping me gain an understanding of Hegel that I don't think that I should have been expected to have without reading this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've never heard of this or encountered it before reading this book. I've never encountered this approach to Hegel at all. And I feel like every single word of this book that I'm reading, I feel like all of the times that you read a passage from Hegel and your eyes just glaze over and you're just like, what the fuck does that mean? This book just like it injects meaning into it. You're like, oh, that's what's going on in that text.
Oh, it's fucking magic.
Yeah.
Hell yeah, it's magic.
I mean, so this is essentially the introduction to the book. What Magee purports to have done here is something that I think he might actually have done, which is given the reader the key to Hegel. Anybody who's ever tried to read Hegel has encountered a lot of words that are difficult. And it appears as though there's always something more to learn later in order to make sense of what you've already read. It's been really great to come to this appreciation of Hegel's method, which is, directly out of, or at least according to the claims made by the author of this book, directly out of the Hermetic tradition, that he circumnavigates the totality of his philosophy and then engages with a piece of it, revealing an aspect of truth here and an aspect of truth there. Because apparently what we're coming to learn is that this is not only how Hegel approaches his own work, but he approaches his own work because this is how he sees the entire process of human history, the entire development of the world. So right out the gate, the very first line of this book, I just think is brilliant. He says, Hegel is not a philosopher. He is no lover or seeker of wisdom. He believes he has found it. And Hegel writes in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit that to help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal where it can lay aside the title of love of knowing and be actual knowledge, that is what I have set before me, which is a hell of a claim. You have to have you have to be really quite sure of yourself to believe that you have arrived at absolute knowledge. So I think what we're going to dig into is have we learned how to learn about Hegel, or are we learning how to learn about Hegel through this book? And then B, has Hegel actually arrived at like a full comprehensive philosophical worldview? One of the most important things that has that stuck with me from the very beginning is that compared to a lot of other Hegel scholarship, at least what I've encountered, which is not as much as McGee, obviously, but contra other Hegel scholars, McGee seems to take Hegel at his word, right? He's like that his, let's call it, religious beliefs or his spiritual aspects of his life are not just idiosyncratic, incidental elements of Hegel the man, but actually are part and parcel to his worldview. And so to the Hegel that we've inherited via fourth hand, via Marxists who read about Marx and what Marx had to say about Hegel, it appears as though we may have been cut off from an ability to understand the work of the man, because not only was he a person who was a Lutheran, but Hegel seems to have been like deliberately squarely positioned within the Hermetic tradition, like in a conscious way, that Hegel even refers to himself as a mystic. And, he refers to the things that he's working on and talking through as mystical. Whether that's like, his association with Freemasonry, his incredible appreciation of the work of occultists like Boma and a bunch of other names I'm going to probably say wrong. His notes on Kabbalism, his Rosicrucianism, that all throughout Hegel's work we're encountering the Hermetic tradition. So just right off the gate, like this introduction to this book to me is just like extremely clarifying. But it also opens up a whole bunch more questions too. Like, what is the Hermetic tradition?
Something I was actually curious about, that I was thinking about in terms of what the Hermetic tradition is too, is I was like, is he just influenced by these people, or was he like actively like a ceremonial magician, which is certainly not what he's claiming in the book. But in kind of like the shortest version I can come up with of what basically the most central tenet, I guess, of most Hermetic traditions is, or pretty much all of them, is that they all share a common goal to achieve knowledge of God. So, but that means to unite spirit and matter. The idea is that we're all a part of God and God is a part of us, but in the way that at one point, and we always have been one whole. And in terms of creation, the need to create the cosmos was in order for him or us to self-actualize, which requires observation. And without an observer, there's no observed. So the microcosm is the observable and comprehensible world for us as perceived by us, and the macrocosm is non-manifested consciousness. So man's knowledge of God becomes God's knowledge of himself, and vice versa. And because of our consciousness and free will, we are the ones who take up the process of the self-knowledge. We're the actualized, like, material agents tasked with observing the inner and the outer creation. So the quest for knowledge becomes a spiritual journey to return to a state of reunion with the divine, of like non-dualism. So what I'm getting at is I'm wondering if, like, when Hegel says, I've achieved philosophy, if what he means is I have ascended to the top level of the tree of life or whatever, and like I'm enlightened.
That's what I took away from it.
Yeah, I think that's
right.
exactly right.
Like,
And,
yeah, when Hegel says absolute knowledge is a permanent agenda, he means for the human race, because
Yes.
they basically need to catch up to other important figures who have achieved, absolute knowledge. People like
Mhm.
Jesus Christ and
But that is
Buddha
only
and Hegel.
He's a really humble guy, you know.
yeah, but that is only possible at the end, after the end of history.
Right.
But what does that mean if we're thinking of Hegel as a Hermeticist? I think that traditionally, whenever we hear the end of history and how we interpret this stuff from like a Western philosophical tradition, that is, I think we read that in one very particular way. But I think to read Hegel this way causes us to have to reinterpret what exactly does that mean. Also, I just want to say there are things in the chapter that I'll discuss on the Hermetic tradition that outside of a Western European context, the idea that you could achieve this like absolute knowledge is actually a commonplace. Like if you look at the traditions of like Hinduism and Buddhism, like this isn't like there are only a handful of people who achieve this. Like it is something I think that is much more accessible. I think it's something about our tradition of sort of like a Christ savior figure that tends to like remove it away from most of us as something we can achieve.
Yeah.
Well,
That's right.
not completely.
Not in the Orthodox Christian
Right. I was going to say
tradition.
like
They have-
apotheosis in Eastern Orthodoxy is definitely a thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
But for most people, how we understand
Uh,
Christianity, it's like seen as something that is not accessible.
Right.
Yeah.
And within Catholicism, you achieve it during the Holy Meal, the Mass.
Yeah. During the communion.
Yeah, exactly. But
Right.
I think I just want to elaborate on what Jenny said, that one of the greatest differences between the classic Orthodox and Catholic view compared to the Hermetic view is the idea of rapture, that there is a divide, that mankind has fallen and can therefore not access God completely within this life.
There's an incredible number of medieval mystics that purport the opposite of that and are semi-heretical yet canonical because they couched it in language that was acceptable.
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
And Hegel, consciously sees his project as making, absolute knowledge accessible, which is maybe the first or second or 12th time reader of Hegel might find somewhat a laughable proposition that Hegel is actually making it accessible. But when you consider what he's talking about, which is full oneness with divinity, you could do worse with explaining the totality of everything than Hegel, but also, that also speaks a lot to why Hegel is regarded, I think, not without serious merit, as an extremely difficult, if not the most difficult philosopher with which to engage, because his project is no less than the project of existence. And at least once you acknowledge that, once we can come to embrace it, then we might be at the beginning, which I think is the hope here, at the beginning of a proper engagement with Hegel, and thus the Hegel that he himself would have presented. Because a friend of mine asked me recently, why read a book like this? Why go all the way back to the roots of, like why not start with the latest? And I feel like, I can make a general claim about the validity of going all the way back to, the origins of something to better understand it, which I think is true. And I think that's just a general case that can be made. But specifically, our project here, and I think this is a shared project across everybody in this group, is that we think we inherited a giant fucking mess. And so just as we're trying to sift through the wreckage of the 20th century to find what in communist and socialist practice is going to be useful to us going forward, and like what in Marx is, prime in terms of method, and what is a historically situated political position, the same should be said about stuff from before Marx. And I think, a proper appreciation of Hegel is not just interesting to us because we're a bunch of weirdos who are interested in the occluded side of life, but also because this is where we come from as Marxists, as inheritors of the communist project. So we may as well start where Marx did with Hegel.
I also want to mention that to me, this book and why we discussed doing it is sort of a spiritual sequel to the Enchantments of Mammon series.
Mhm.
That book ends with a discussion about learning to see the kingdom of God everywhere, all around you, all the time. Like that is McCarraher's sort of final conclusion. It's also the final conclusion of a lot of psychoanalytic thought of like, we need a revolution in consciousness to be able to start to like break apart this inheritance that we have and the sort of grip and the haunting that it's held on us. I think that what this book does is a way to sort of fill in the gaps of the mystery school traditions that McCarraher did not speak to, which we did talk about in an episode. But I think it's also a way to say, maybe this is a much better approach to think about what does that really mean to have this sort of revolution in like subjective conditions, to say it one way.
Absolutely. In a sense, you could say that just like what we're trying to do with the broader project of communism, we're also trying to do with the universalist, the older universalisms of religion and of philosophy. We're trying to, in a way, we're trying to take Hegel, who has been stood on his head, and put him back on his feet. Because we're trying to basically, we think maybe the left Hegelians, the younger ones, the radicals, probably had the right approach of trying to take what was revolutionary in Hegel and then move on. Whereas the right Hegelians were looking at what's more eternal and more permanent. They had a more conservative approach to Hegel, and now we're at a place similar to how we can be with religion and also with politics to flip things back over. We can Aufhebung, we can negate the negation in our approach to these things.
Yes, and I think that is also important, not only for understanding Marx, but since most people in this room have at least a passing interest in psychoanalysis. Freud's favorite philosopher was Feuerbach, which was one of the late Hegelians. And if we are to justify this project of reading the hermeneutic tradition within an Hegelian framework, within Hegel's own words, it is a project of recollection. We are trying to remember and walk through our own history and confronts ourselves with our own mistakes so that we can take responsibility for the freedom that has been given us, basically.
Yeah. I think there's also a way that we're trying to recollect and take responsibility for that freedom, but also to have something that can meaningfully confront the conditions of just utter cynicism and nihilism that we're all kind of like responding to in our work anyway. Like for me, I mean, just this is a little bit of my sort of background coming into this work. So I would say that I actually started as a Hermeticist, got into Western philosophy, became a communist, and I'm now returning to this. And I think one of the reasons why I am is because to me, I'm coming back to this through the political sort of landscape to understand how much this helps me think about what does it mean to be like, quote unquote, like a revolutionary? Like, what does it mean to think about like ecology and like animal life and, being a social being? Like, cause for me, I think a big part of the implication that we've discussed in a lot of episodes we've done is we have to think of a way to conceive of ourselves as subjects that is somehow differentiated as an I, as an individual, and also part of a much greater collective than ourselves, which to me is kind of at the end of the day, like the utopian vision of what it is to be a communist is like, you are like both the coincidentia oppositorum in Hermetic language. You are the coincidence of opposites. You are the individual and the collective whole at the same time. So for me, I think this sort of approach helps us at least start to talk about that in a way that I don't really think we have in just thinking about Marxist language.
Yeah. And I also think that the value in doing this sort of a study, beyond just being interesting, and it helps me to understand stuff that I wanted to understand, I think that's a value in itself. But the value is there's also an additional value of having a better grasp on the source material makes it less manipulable. I think I find anyway a lot on the left where people will just sort of like take shit that nobody really understands, but it's an from an authoritative text, and they'll just use it to mean what they want it to mean, or whatever serves the purposes of whatever point they're trying to make, that sort of thing. And I think being able to say, no, I don't think that's what that text is actually saying, is a useful thing, you know. Even if we don't necessarily agree with Hegel's conclusions about any given thing. I think it's useful to understand what he's actually saying. And so for me, the way the author presented Hermeticism, which is frankly a foreign concept to me, the way that it made the most sense to me was through Hegel's concept of alienation specifically, as McGee presents Hermeticism as he presents it as mysticism is like an umbrella category under which Gnosticism is one subcategory and Hermeticism is another subcategory. Those are sort of two different traditions within the broader umbrella of mysticism. That clarified things a lot for me. And but Hegel's concept of alienation, I think, is what really sealed that distinction with Gnosticism in my mind, because the way he presents Gnosticism is that this is an extremely reductionist sort of presentation of it, but it's a way it's a couple of hooks that I can put categories on in my mind and help make sense of things. But in Gnosticism, alienation from oneness with God, that is a flaw, that is an error, that is it is an incomplete, makes God incomplete, and we're trying to overcome that separation, that alienation, and return to God and become complete. However, in Hermeticism, and in Hegel's theory of alienation is what makes God complete. Being able to be separate from God and perceive God as a separate being is the completion of God's being, God's existence. And so, and Hegel, I was recently listening to a scholar, and I forget his name, so I can't attribute it, unfortunately. A scholar talking about alienation in Hegel, where he says that this is a distinction between Marx's concept of alienation, where he's trying to get, he's talking about overcoming alienation and arriving in a society that is triumphed over alienation. Hegel's alienation is a condition of being, that we are the part of what it is to be alienated together.
This is also, I think, a really key difference between Gnosticism and Hermeticism, which is that it isn't that there's this separation and then sort of fundamental break in alienation from God. There has to be like the fall, and I'll talk about this in the Hermetic tradition, but there's the fall from paradise, but then there has to also be a fall upward. So there's this third movement that distinguishes it, which is where, in a way, separation must occur. There has to be a boundary, a barrier that must occur. And then the sort of third final movement is where there is opposition, but knowing both parts as one and the same. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's also a big part of what distinguishes those two. And it also is like a foundational concept in Hegel's work, especially the phenomenology as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, the way that the Hegel's thought is presented when it is divorced from anything that would be offensive to a like 19th century rationalist, secular humanist liberal, right? Once you strip all of this away, what you're left with is just impenetrable concepts. Like when, the term Geist, does he mean, is it mind? Is it spirit? Is it spirit of the age, or is it spirit in the sense of God? Right. And there's like a debate about how to translate words. And it's like, well, no, it's all of those things. Hegel doesn't believe that there is any, fundamental antagonism or irreconcilable antagonism, at least, between God and culture, right? The movement of a people through historical development and one's individual consciousness. In fact, he would, apparently he's actually just talking about the way in which these are all the same thing. And it's just, it just unlocks some things.
Yes. And like Hegel's notion of alienation is very much classical Hermetic one, and that is inspired very much by by Augustinus, Augustine, and from there to Plotinus, the idea that we are separated from the good from God, and that is an ontological, that alienation is ontological and not just the product of capitalist society. But what is the difference between this and most other Christian traditions is that the hermeneutic one claims that one way to overcome this lack, sin, is through knowledge, through reason. And here we see why Hegel fits so neatly both within the Enlightenment project of reason and also within the Hermetic tradition, this striving for reason, even though I think Hegel means different things with reason and knowledge. I think that is where one of the fundamental distinction between Christian orthodoxy and the Hermetic tradition is knowledge, and that knowledge can overcome sin, and alienation and sin is basically the same thing.
Or is the one is the result of the other? Or I guess they're the same thing. They're co-constituents.
Yeah, like sin basically means a lack, that something is broken.
Yeah.
So I do think that the introduction to this book lays out, a sort of a guidebook, a sort of a roadmap rather, as to how to get through the book, which is something that Hegel himself doesn't do with his own work. But the primary task of this book is to demonstrate the influence of Hermeticism on Hegel, to situate Hegel within Hermeticism, and render it impossible to treat Hegel as an arch rationalist forevermore, or to even be able to read Hegel in a non-metaphysical manner. So I imagine we're setting out to try to see if that's all true. I think so far we're finding it might be. In addition to that, I would say that when I think back to episodes we've done, going back to some of our earliest ones about the romantic strain that is sort of surviving throughout, at least on the fringes in an explicit way, but, at the core of Marxism in an implicit way. If that's a thing that we're trying to excavate and posit more fully, right? In this way of trying to develop a Marxism that is A, without guarantees, but also B, which is, attempting to deal with alienation in the here and now, and not just relegating everything to, after the revolution, right? After the end of history. What I'm hoping that we'll find is that Hegel as Hermetic thinker is the key to unlocking Hegel overall, which is a critical component of our constituting a new revolutionary project, which is not just an extension of, like positivist science and like conquering nature and reconstructing human beings according to a plan, but actually, or at least according to, maybe we won't reject all plans, but maybe what we'll find is that we're trying to do a communism according to God's plan.
God's plan.
Anyways, I don't know. That's all I had for the introduction.
Yeah, I mean, the basic gist of the introduction is that we cannot read Hegel outside of the religious milieu that he was brought up in, and the Hermetic tradition is that milieu, and Hegel must be read as a religious and mystical thinker as much as a social thinker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's he meant the author McGee references that a lot of academic scholars, a lot of scholarly thinkers who engage with Hegel regard him as so difficult precisely because they're not engaging with his Hermetic his engagement with the Hermetic tradition, which makes him so much harder to understand. Like it's just, if you're only approaching him as a philosophical thinker who's engaging with the philosophical tradition descended from Plato through Descartes and Kant to Hegel or whatever, then it's going to be a lot. You're going to miss a lot of stuff, and everything's just going to make a lot less sense if it's not put in context.
Can we actually? I just thought of this. While we have a couple minutes left, we're going to say the word hermetic a lot, and Jess gave us a definition of hermeticism. Is it worth actually talking about like Hermes Trismegistus and like where it comes from?
First, I was going to ask if anybody, I meant to look it up beforehand. If we know for sure that's the proper way to say his name, I meant to look it up, and you'd think I would know, but I don't.
Hermes Trismegistus.
Say it like an asshole.
Yeah, like if you want to just say it
like an American.
Say it like an American is Hermes Trismegistus.
Yeah, or Magistus. Magistus.
I think it's Magistus. All right. That's where the name comes from. You can just edit one of those in there. But who may or may not have been a real person. It seems like he might have been a combination of Greek and Egyptian, which probably seems more likely because these things kind of came out of the same time. And the very basics of this come from the Emerald Tablet, which is a not very long sort of just rundown, I guess, of this stuff. But it's really like, it's a small but powerful thing that sort of outlines what I did before about just sort of the basic tenets of it. And that kind of sprouted all of this because pretty much all of these traditions, even despite their little things that, their rituals that may be a little bit different or, even variations on belief, they all start at and even now still have that as the basic underlying of the belief.
Word.
Cool.
So I'm going to roughly guide us through chapter 1, which is a brief overview of the Hermetic tradition, sort of starting around the influence of Hermetic philosophy in, I guess like Western Europe, leading up to, I guess, sort of Hegel's early years in chapter 2. So, I don't want us to just necessarily like run down a bunch of like bare facts, but I think we should sort of touch on the key thinkers that make up that tradition that leads up to Hegel's influence. And I think it'll also help us to sort of lay out some of the basic concepts or sort of like core tenets of what Hermetic philosophy is. So that was kind of my game plan of how to approach this.
Nope. Start over.
Okay. That was wrong. That was all wrong. Okay. So I put my notes in the chat for anyone who wants to follow along. So, hey, Jess, correct me if I'm wrong, or Chris, since your language skills are much better than mine. So Hermes Trismegistus or Gistus means thrice great Hermes. That's how I've heard it translated. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say king shit for being called the thrice great Hermes.
He's super, super, super great.
He is
great. The great Hermes.
All right, so I'm going to start with Proclus. And McGee talks about Proclus as being a 5th century philosopher and the first philosopher to show pretty direct Hermetic influence. He was a systematizer of Neoplatonic philosophy, mainly through his addition of teleology into the framework. He used the dialectic and triadic forms, which we're going to see obviously being huge in Hegel's work. But there was a core sort of tenet in Proclus's views that the many are the one and the one are the many. And we're going to see this as like a really key thing in Hermetic philosophy, that there's this coincidence of opposites and the mediation between the two that are usually going to be like core in how we think about it. And kind of like what you were saying also, Jess, that so for like God or the one to be complete, creation must sort of happen. Like it must be part of the process. And I think this is a key difference from things like Gnosticism and Neoplatonic philosophy, which is that there is God or the one, creation emanates from that, but it isn't like a necessity. It's just kind of like, well, God is God and everything is possible and it just kind of happens, but it isn't seen as being a necessity for the completion of God or the one to have the many as well. So that's a key thing about Hermetic philosophy that distinguishes it. All right.
Right. And there's like the comparison to a painter who's not really a painter unless they actually make a painting. Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
well, I really appreciated
God by creating.
Yeah.
I really appreciated the motif of the mirror, of like creation is the mirror through which God can see himself.
Yeah, exactly.
That completes God by allowing him to perceive himself.
Yeah, there's a quote from Hildegard of Bingen that basically God is sort of the creation of all these mirrors, and all those mirrors reflect each other, and that's like part of what creation is. I just want to tag this in too. There's a similar metaphor within the Hindu tradition called Indra's net. Have y'all ever heard of this? The Jewels of Indra?
Yeah.
I don't know it.
So the idea is that creation is essentially God taking on like an infinite like number of forms as these jewels. And essentially what creation is every like unique point of like a material entity is simply one of these jewels reflecting back every other jewel and is being reflected back. And that's kind of how they envision what like sort of the relation between the one and the many are. So it's interesting that Hildegard von Bingen is also like speaking to that pretty directly within a different sort of lexicon.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also a theme with Augustine, who has a similar but a bit different view, where the ultimate mirrors are the Trinity. Like since God is three, the Son, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, God can reflect upon himself through his different aspects.
Mm-hmm.
But he reflects himself in the world through the church, which is the Holy Spirit. So, and the Holy Spirit and the church, which is Christ, completes himself in God. So there are similarities in Christian orthodoxy with the mirrors, but there are also differences.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really struck me in like reading philosophy and specifically older philosophy that was firmly grounded in Christianity is how sclerotic modern American Protestantism is.
Oh God, yeah.
And how lacking in any sort of depth and understanding of its foundation. I'm painting with a very broad brush because there are clearly, specifically among the more mainline Protestant denominations that require a deep amount of schooling in philosophy and theology for their clergy. There's a lot more in the upper levels of these churches. But, you know, I grew up very low Protestant in the South. Mm-hmm. And our understanding of theology is nil, you know, and it's devoid of any kind of this rich complexity that comes out in studying this sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
not
sure.
Hermeticism, but Christian philosophy in general.
Yeah, no, same here. Exactly. My you know, whatever. I was raised in a Christian faith that was very hard to distinguish from a concept of God as old man in the sky who's waiting to punish you for doing bad things and watching you all the time. And that's it. That's the depth of the tradition.
Yep. Well, right. And like, how many times as a kid did you hear, well, you know, God moves in mysterious ways, as a way of hand waving the need for, or even the desire for understanding of whatever the complex issue is, whether it's the nature of existence or why something bad happened to you when you were a little kid and you're just trying to make sense of the world. And it's really unfortunate because, like, if, you know, the tradition of contemplating the mysteries in a constant attempt to comprehend them just seems so much more, let's say, spiritually fulfilling, it's so much more maintenance on one's species being than a philosophical, religious, and or political tradition, which says ours is not to reason why, ours is but to do and die. Like, it's setting up the dichotomy between, like, oh, well, you know, some things are just too big to understand on the one hand, and then the other tradition which says full freedom, the full actualization of humanity is in understanding, and understanding is attainable to everyone, not just the experts.
It's the Christian version of it's dialectics, bro.
Right. And what's so frustrating about that is, like, its dialectics is really, it's like like, it's the opposite of the spirit in which, you know, Hegel's entire dialectical method is what it's for, right? The entire purpose of it is to render the world more comprehensible. And it's the same with, like, reading Capital. You know, people say, like, oh, it's just so complex. You know, don't worry about it. That's for the smart people. It's like, no, the point is that you actually have the capacity to grapple with and comprehend, and thus, you know, have a more intelligible, totalizing view of existence and your role within it. That is that is a grand tradition that we are very much meant to be the bearers of. It's sad to see, a red flag being waved around to wave away questions.
Yeah.
Just as much as it is to have a cross being waved around to wave away questions. It is a sign of decadence.
Mm-hmm.
And our role is to birth the new era.
Yes, and it's not so much a red flag as a white flag, because it is
Yeah,
relation.
that's right.
And it's also reactionary. So
one thing I really loved about this chapter is I learned about a bunch of people that I need to learn about. In particular, Meister Eckhart.
Yeah.
Eckhart
and all the language.
The king.
All of the language around the Holy Trinity, with the Father being the creator and the Son being being creation, being whether it's the whole of nature or the specific concentrated manifestation of divine creation in the form of human beings, right?
Yeah.
And then the Holy Spirit as the process by which creation returns to the creator. So suddenly, like, being moved by the Holy Spirit takes on this much greater weight when viewed through the lens of the movement of spirit through man toward God as the project of and process of gnosis. Well, I really feel like extra wrinkles formed in my brain when reading just this chapter.
So, Jason, I have Meister Eckhart as the first big figure in the notes, so I'll just sort of go ahead and touch on a few key things. So the other thing I did want to mention, just to lead us up to this, so there's this birth of Hermetic philosophy in Egypt, and then how did it get to Western Europe? Like, how did this happen? And just very briefly, that basically came through, I would say, like, sort of the Romans and then into the Renaissance, through a couple of key texts that Jess mentioned as well. So first there was what was called the Latin Asclepius, and the Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablet were sort of like the only portions of that were translated and brought over. But the oldest version of the Emerald Tablet, I think, is like dated to 8th century Spain. So, but the idea is like that tradition was sort of kept alive primarily through the practices and teachings of alchemy. And so we're going to sort of touch on how, like, alchemy is a big part of how this tradition gets translated and transferred down through generations. So also prior to Eckhart, I think we do have to just touch on really quickly Albertus Magnus, who was the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. And so Magnus also has some pretty clear, I guess, like, McGee calls him the first Germanic figure that we could actually call Hermetic. And I do think there's this anecdote I heard about Aquinas once after reading the Summa Theologica that, he had written, he didn't even complete it, but he had written just like thousands upon thousands of pages. And then he has this mystical experience and then basically says, everything I've written is essentially just like, what do you call it? Like strands of hay. It was just like, it was kind of pointless to write all this shit whenever I just had this mystical experience. And it just basically, like, that is what the experience is. So I think just kind of knowing that even in someone like Aquinas, and learning from Magnus, that this tradition and these teachings are sort of part of that in the background.
Actually, Adam, real quick before we move on, I do just think it's really fun to know that Aquinas suggests that Hermes Trismegistus got his knowledge from writings handed down by Abel. Which the more I learn about these people, the more I want to know. I want to walk through that story in Aquinas's view. I want to know that process.
So I wrote a paper about Roger Bacon and his sort of justifications for using magic, Christian justifications for using magic. But so essentially all of the knowledge of how to manipulate the forces in the world is it's all there, and it's all just natural knowledge, and you can tap into it. But you have to have, like, purity of spirit and, the right concentration of mind that only comes through, like, being like a good Christian to be able to do that. So Bacon says that, like, it's necessary to be able to do alchemy and to be able to do natural magics is what he calls, this manipulation of nature. He calls it a science, and it's what's called by others natural magic. It's all stuff that the angels and the demons know how to do. So in order to defend the church and Christendom from the Antichrist, Christians need to know how to do magic and alchemy and astrology and everything. So It's and all of this stuff he says is handed down from the patriarchs through figures like Hermes Trismegistus and Aristotle to the medieval scholars.
What I found especially compelling in the text here was the sort of the littering of through the text of the historical context that gives you a sense of here's the world that existed that Hegel was growing up into. And so he says stuff like in the 14th century in Germany, it was known as the Century of Heresy because it witnessed a tremendous flowering of mysticism because Germans were had no higher education institution there, and they had to go learn in France and Italy, which had received some of this mysticism, mystic thought from that had been preserved in Europe through Arabic Spain.
Yeah, and part of why that happened is because Marsilius Ficino, who was currently working under the Medicis, was translating the Platonic dialogues at the time, and once they got the Hermeticum, they told him to stop translating Plato and immediately focus on the Hermeticum. And that's kind of where all this sort of like really exploded and flowered, was from that discovery of those texts.
And it took a root in Germany because Germany was many kingdoms, and the turmoil of the political situation made the retreat into a mystical world much more urgent than in France or Spain, which had central powers.
Yeah. So I'm going to come back to Eckhart just to touch on a couple of core concepts. So there's a passage that McGee has where there's a story that whenever Hegel read Eckhart, he just sort of exclaimed like, there, we have what we want. So, there's this firm grounding in like Hegel seeing his own thought or an antecedent of his own thought reflected into Eckhart. And so a couple of just things about him I think are really important. Sort of the key figure that systematized the German language into areas of philosophy, theology, and the sciences through translating Latin terms into German. And Eckhart saw, we talked about this, that like knowing, or sort of, I think in Latin, I guess this would be like intelligere. For Eckhart, this was the basic attribute of the divine. And unlike Aristotle's divine mover, like Eckhart's divine is thoroughly involved in the world. God must create to actualize his nature. And there's this sort of idea that creation or like humankind are required to complete the circle of God's being. And the idea of the circle is going to be really firm and a big part of like Hegel's conception as well. But we all have the divine spark of the sun, and we are here to find that spark, affirm it, and strive to develop and increase the divine within us to basically hold up that mirror to creation so God, like the Logos, can know itself through its knowing in this sort of like, differentiated part, but also knowing itself as one.
Yeah. And I just want to get into, because I'm a big fan of Eckhart, and I've studied him quite closely. He was excommunicated, not because of his teachings, but because how his teachings could be read. Yeah. So what they said was, you're not wrong, but you could be read in a dangerous way. And Eckhart was a monk, a priest, and his main preoccupation was with guiding nuns on their spiritual journey. And here I think the tension between the Hermetic and the Catholic tradition becomes clearest. That is what the Hermetic and Hegel means with knowledge, and what the Eckhart might have meant with knowledge. And that in Hegel and the Hermetic tradition, knowledge is about reason and magic and that sort of things. Knowledge. But what Eckhart and the Catholic Church teaches is, but when we're talking about that you should know God, it is not so much knowledge as an intellectual pursuit, but more as a relationship. To know God as you know your friend, to know God as you know your lover. And one of the reasons why Eckhart was perceived so dangerously was that you could read him either as this extremely erotic writer who wrote about the relationship between God and man as a lover's relationship where you get to know each other, or so in social relationships, or in relationships of knowledge, which is the more Hermetic or Hegelian way of seeing it. So that it is here that we see the Hermetic tradition mainly drift off from the mainline Catholic and Orthodox traditions, because with Albert and Magnus, they were both perceived to be the same thing. But around this time, we open up a rift between knowledge as a relationship and knowledge as a practical and intellectual pursuit. And that rift is only deepened the longer time goes.
So are we discussing lost horizons of thought, traditions that could have been but were not?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
Most
right.
vintage of all Lost Horizons.
Mm.
I mean, I suppose it depends on how you conceive of things, because Hegel doesn't think so. Hegel thinks that, the birth of Christianity is one of those world historic moments which, resolves the past up to that point and births the future from that point. And even if it, in its universalism, requires a kind of vulgarization of doctrine in order for it to be broadly palatable, he sees that as a step in the direction, right? That his own project of not reviving, but bringing forth, the Hermetic tradition within the framework of a universalism like Christianity is a matter of gaining more than the Hermetic tradition could gain without having been supplanted by a vulgar Christianity. That's that movement, right? To forward and upward, but in spirals.
Yes, and Hegel was very preoccupied, and we'll come into this more in chapter 3, with the rift between understanding and between the natural and the humanistic sciences, and he wanted to integrate them. Integrate them. That was one of his projects, and I would like to stress that here we see the divergence path with Master Eckhart, with focusing on social relationships and spiritual relationships, where we later saw focus on either pure religion or pure knowledge, and that those two drifted apart.
So one figure, too, I think we should just touch on for some core concepts that are going to influence Hegel is Nicholas of Cusa. So a couple of things from him that I think we're going to see reflected in Hegel's approach as well is, again, we kind of mentioned God as the coincidence of opposites, or the coincidentia positorum. He also had this concept of the internal relations, which is that you can only understand one thing by its relationship to everything else, that there is always this sort of everything is defined by its opposite and by its sort of othering that has to occur. There's also the concept of the doctrine of learned ignorance, which he is most famous for, which is that we can actually predicate nothing univocally to God. So we can only say that God is both like the maximum and the minimum. We can only understand God through framing it as like the coincidence of two opposite sort of extremes, or mutually opposed dichotomies. Right. So we talked a little bit about Ficino, translation. So I mainly just want to touch on two key figures, Giordano Bruno and Jacob Böhme, that we have discussed. So Hegel devoted sections of his lectures on philosophy of history to Bruno, definitely had his works in his library. I have in my notes that Bruno took Ficino's vanilla-ass Christian magic of correspondences and developed it into the basis of a new Hermetic religion, and got it back to its pagan Egyptian roots.
It's my shit.
Yeah, that's the jam right there. Hegel called Bruno's philosophy an objective Spinozism, And his critique of Bruno is interestingly very similar to his critique of Kant. But one of the things that I think we do want to make sure we touch on is that in Bruno, we see that the use of memory, or the art of memory, is really important. This idea of recollection, that the process of knowledge, of actually not just seeking knowledge, but obtaining knowledge, kind of like what Jess was saying earlier, is that it is this ability to recollect the cosmic forces that are, we're sort of part of this process of, and it leads to a kind of self-actualization and self-transformation and a sort of new and powerful personality of the person who sort of obtains this knowledge. That's like kind of part of the process. And I think we're going to see this too with how Hegel structures the phenomenology, which is really, I think, kind of a very sophisticated initiation, right, of reading through these developments of consciousness to eventually lead you to the point where you not just like think about the absolute, but you become the absolute knowing itself through going through the initiation.
Well, Bruno's discussion of Spinoza is, I think where McGee sort of unites the pantheism of Spinoza with the Hermetic tradition. In Hegel's thought, he brings up the system of Bruno's is objective Spinozism and nothing else. One can see how deeply he penetrated Hegel writes about Spinozism pantheism is how McGee terms it. Hegel writes, the main endeavor of Bruno was to represent the all and one after the method of Lullus, a system of classes of regular determinations. That the section goes on too long to just read all that usefully, but I just wanted, I wanted to bring up that Bruno is how Spinoza's pantheism enters Hegel, according to McGee.
Were you going to mention anything about Agrippa?
I had him in my notes, Jess, but I mean, please go for it if you want to talk, because I feel like we should mention Agrippa. I just don't have a ton.
Breeze right through the Renaissance too, but yeah, it's not as relevant. Yeah.
Well, they don't really. He didn't really write that much about Agrippa. Really, he just kind of gave a little history, sort of of his life. I don't think he really mentioned like what influence he might have had on Hegel or anything, but more just sort of on the overall situation. Agrippa is important because the 3 books of occult philosophy are like foundational, basically for Hermeticism, and they're also really important to Kabbalah. Well, they're very heavily influenced by Kabbalah, but the way that he presents it there, especially because it becomes so foundational, to have that information in there is helpful to people. I actually have the first book right here, but I think when we get to the parts about Kabbalah, I'm more likely to mention Agrippa and like talk about that a little bit more. But I just thought it would probably be worth bringing him up as we're talking about people who were like really important to the history of Hermeticism.
So he mentions here, he talks about Agrippa and his ideas of natural magic, which I mentioned when I was talking about Roger Bacon. So he essentially just sort of expounds upon these ideas that had existed before him in other ways. Mm-hmm. And like the idea of celestial magic as being able to harness the power of the stars and harness the power of the world soul, being in communion with the soul of the world, and the idea that the practitioner of magic becomes co-operational with God in manipulating the forces of nature.
Yeah. He gets celestial magic is in the later books, and like I said, I'll talk about this in more detail when we get to Kabbalah probably. But the celestial magic stuff is like absolutely bonkers. It's so cool. It's actually like what I actively practice a little bit. But I don't know if you've ever seen, and I'll probably show you even though people listening won't be able to see it, but he came up with this whole system of magic squares that are used to construct sigils that you use to call upon the planetary intelligences and spirits. And they're based on like the correlation of Hebrew letters to numbers. And it's like really, really wacky. And I actually don't even entirely understand how he constructed the magic squares yet. But I think something that he also covers, he might have been one of the first people to bring this up in a book, is the tetragrammaton, which is the unspeakable name of God. Basically, the characters in Hebrew more or less translate to I am, which is also what God said to Moses in the Bible. And they don't really know, like, supposedly how it was originally pronounced. And because there's the tradition of, like, in Judaism of you not speaking the true name of God, it just never really got carried down. So it's usually pronounced as like Yahweh or
Jehovah.
But sometimes those are just names that are used to replace it so that they don't have to say the name of God, like Adonai or Elohim and stuff. So, but yeah, that there is like a huge tenet of a lot of celestial magic and stuff too. And I think he was one of the first people to kind of like popularize it, I guess. So
the only other thing I want to say about Agrippa is that I just think, because it's important in terms of situating all of these things in the study of Hegel, as that they found in Hegel's library the 4th volume of Agrippa's what is it?
That's a fake one. He didn't really write that one, but people still like it. It's still important. It still has good stuff in it. But
Hegel didn't know it was fake.
Well, sure. I mean, that's good to know. I didn't know that. But the fact that Hegel had the copy of Magical Ceremonies, which is the supposed 4th volume of the Occult Philosophy by Agrippa. The only reason to mention that is, like everybody that like Bruno and everybody that's been mentioned already, and everybody that's about to be mentioned once we let Adam talk again, is that these aren't just figures in the Hermetic tradition. These are figures that Hegel comments on, writes notes about, has books from, and with highlighting and like that. It's highlighter. It's important to remember the reason why we're going through this is because these aren't just his intellectual precursors. These are people that he's trying to learn from and synthesize.
Yeah, that we have evidence that he actively engaged with intellectually.
Yeah.
One last thing about Agrippa too. Agrippa, I think, was also trying to develop this pan-sophic idea of a super science as well. And I think that's absolutely like a huge influence on Hegel and Hegel's system as well, right?
That's another Roger Bacon thing as well. Yeah.
All right. So last person I have, maybe worth really diving into, is Jacob Boma. But let me see. I did have something on, who are the 2 people before? It's like Frank and
Frank and...
Oh, wait, no. Paracelsus was also a guy in there?
Yeah.
Frank and Vigo.
Anyway, there's like so many people in the tradition, it's hard to feel like, who do we want to focus on? Did y'all want to add anything about Paracelsus?
No. Just his name.
Because it's fucking lit.
Yeah, it's the coolest name. Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Now we can move on from Paracelsus.
Yeah. Stage name MC Paracelsus, though. All right. Let me see. Let me pull my notes back up. Okay, so maybe the biggest figure in this chapter to talk about at the end is Jacob Boma. Huge figure in the Hermetic tradition, sort of is alive in the late 16th, early 17th century. So a couple of things about Boma's general vision. Basically started with a mystical vision that he had from light being reflected on a pewter vessel, which he said allowed him to peer into the inner essence of all things. I just thought that was pretty fucking lit. I use drugs. Jacob Boma just pewed into a pewter vessel. You know, whatever gets you there.
Well, I mean, you hear stories about like Buddhist figures or whatever attaining an enlightenment when they hear a bell ring or something like that. It's reminiscent of that sort of thing, where it's like this totally banal material encounter renders them utterly transformed.
There's this really amazing anecdote where there's one of the sutras where the Buddha is talking about a meditation and achieving enlightenment. He's basically saying, you know, listen, you can meditate on the sound of a bell, you can meditate on the gods, you can meditate on X, Y, or Z. And he says you can pretty much just meditate on anything. And if you approach it in a certain way, like enlightenment happens. And then apparently in the actual sutras that were written down, they said, they like had a little asterisk and they said, but not any evil thing. I think it's an amazing anecdote.
Adam, on the subject of, you know, you said you use drugs and Boma used the pewter bowl. I feel like it's actually that is something worthy of unpacking just a little bit, because we live in an age of like excessive overstimulation. So the ability to like remove oneself from the constant bombardment of modernity, whether it's, you know, the fact that you're perpetually available through your smartphone, or that everything's linked to everything else. Your watch is going to go off when somebody likes a photo that you took in 2019, whatever, all that is. I don't even know if we can fully conceptualize what it actually is like to be in a place where you've been so divorced from that for so long that you could just be meditating on a thing without external distractions. Drugs are what we need to get to a place that should be normal.
Or a monastery.
So
or you could become a monk, but the other option is to do drugs.
So the frankincense, the uses of frankincense. Frankincense is a mild hallucinogen.
Mm-hmm. So
that's used every Sunday in your Catholic church, right?
Yeah.
And you can use it when you're meditating as well. You can use it when you're like praying or whatever. And this is something that I wanted to bring up, is that this meditation on random things isn't necessarily just an Eastern thing. It's very common within Catholicism as well.
No.
But more common in Catholicism is meditating on the mysteries. And there's, of course, an institutionalized practice of praying the rosary, which is meditation. It's a form of repetitive prayer that is intended to produce that connection to the divine that is just meditating. So it's like when you look at the Western monastic tradition, there's lots of this. In the Western mystic tradition, it's very similar to the Eastern mystic tradition in the sense that this exact same process of communicating with the divine is being replicated.
One thing I think this is important to bring up about this connection to Hegel is Hegel's sort of grounding in the Hermetic tradition also helps us make sense of how what Hegel was doing was sort of kind of trying to initiate the reader and into the system, but as also a way to be initiated in what's called like the perennial philosophy.
Yeah.
Which
I was just going to say something about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think maybe we should like touch on this too, that a lot of these approaches of like meditation and prayer and certain traditions taking certain psychoactive substances, but these are all like sort of different ways. I mean, for some, even in like schools of yogic philosophy, there are many different paths to Shiva, to the Brahman. And it's kind of like in the Hindu tradition, it's just like, yeah, like, listen, you just take whatever way gets you there. But the idea is that they're all different avenues to this one singular moment, which I think is what we also call the perennial philosophy. It's this sort of like underlying, like the Urgrund, like the sort of dark inchoate, like grounding of all these different traditions. And it's a way to like try to get to that, I think.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting about more specifically Kabbalah, but is in Hermeticism, is it almost sort of like acknowledges the perennial philosophy, but sort of just like in itself, like with the Kabbalah, the tree of life, every sphere on there, whatever, like plane of consciousness, they're called separaevs, are associated with both like a tarot card, a planet. On the paths, there's the zodiac signs, there's archangels, angels, like it draws from basically every other sort of like religion or like related system of Hermeticism, and it kind of like and it doesn't just like shove it in there, it fits perfectly, which is really cool. But that's just something I was thinking about when I thought about the concept of like a perennial philosophy. It's like Hermeticism almost has its like own baby version of that.
A few things that we've already mentioned. We talked about sort of where Boma's like mystical vision is the starting point. Just a few other key things that I think we're going to see in the influence of Boma on Hegel. So the idea is that God is an active process unfolding within the world and within history. So God is not static and outside of it, but like history is the unfolding of God.
Yeah.
And all of this again is about there's this like abundance of God, and not just like creation is this sort of secondhand kind of aspect of it, but God only knows itself through creating this division, this setting up of a boundary, and then knowing itself through the relation of the two. And I think we need to also be really clear here that there is a distinction to be made between this approach and it not being pantheism. So in pantheism, all things are divine. But in this approach, it isn't that like God is in all things or all things are full of gods, but that the world itself is part of God's being. There isn't this like mediation of a spirit in something. It's like the very thing itself is God, which I think is a pretty key distinction to just understand why this is not exactly pantheism in the way that we typically think about it. Christ is the nature of God in the world revealed to humankind. So there's the Father, the Son, and then the Holy Spirit. The mediation between the two is where God knows itself through nature and the Son. And I think that's kind of a big element of Boma's philosophy too, is that the Holy Spirit is the mediation of these two sort of opposite things.
So would that be considered a panentheism rather than pantheism, where like God is present in all things, but is like different in substance?
I mean, my first gut instinct is to say it's still the idea that there is the substance is still creating like the separation that would be different in this view.
Yeah.
That's my first thought. I was curious what other people
Yeah.
think.
I think the distinction is that in panentheism, there's a connection. Everything is there's no separation. And I think this approach is saying it is distinct in saying that there is a separation.
No, like in panentheism, there's there's an ontological distinction between divine and non-divine. Right. Yeah.
But yes, no, that's absolutely right. That's a very good point. But I think a distinction has to be drawn here in that with panentheism, there's a distinction in substance, but there's not a distinction in the God within is not separated.
Okay. So I'm thinking about it in like Eastern Orthodox terms.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let me actually read a quote from Boma. This is in his primary work, Aurora. And I thought this is just a pretty amazing and beautiful quote. So Boma says, "You need not ask, where is God? Hearken, you blind man, you live in God and God is in you. If you live holily, then therein you yourself are God."
Yes, and that is also like very present in the Jesuit tradition, who is famous for seeing God in everything, where we also come into this recollection, where one of the spiritual exercises is to look backwards on your life retroactively and see God in everything, leading up to this point. So the past is nothing static, but is something that you rewrite with the help of God, in the presence of God, just like in psychoanalysis.
As I say, that's got big psychoanalytic energy to it.
Yeah, and there is a big school of Catholic psychoanalysts, and they are all almost all situated within the Jesuit tradition.
I met a priest who was studying psychoanalysis in order just to be a better counselor, but he was going full Jungian.
Nice.
Oh God.
Why? I actually really do enjoy reading Jung, even if I don't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions.
Adam and Mir are out. They're just like, pull the cord, we're done.
Fuck this shit. Fuck this
I will have to say, my relationship to Jung is complicated because I got into Jung first before Freud because of the alchemical part. Because of coming
that's
from
why
this
Jung is
tradition.
cool.
Yeah, and I was like, wow, this is great. And then I was also like, oh, but again, the conclusions and some of the implications are just complete garbage and reactionary. So I was like, but I think, but the connection to the alchemical tradition is the thing that I always appreciated most about Jung.
I don't know much about Jung, but I was thinking about this guy, Boma, and how he relates to Hegel.
Pro podcaster move.
I was when I read in this book, when McGee mentions that in Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy that he has 28 pages of notes just on this one guy. That's what made me buy the book. When I just decided I needed to go through the whole thing, and it's thick. It's like this big. So I'm looking forward to diving into this person that Hegel relied so heavily on, but also said whose mind was confined to the hard oak of the senses, which is to say that he was like just grasping, but not quite fully taking in hand this sort of absolute that Hegel believes that we're all arriving at. But maybe he saw him as one of the closest to getting there prior to himself.
I do think that this is a really good point to end on. So I guess the influence of Boma on Hegel, Harris basically says starts around 1801. I mean, one thing that I think we do see in Boma that we're directly going to see in Hegel is, again, this telling of the story of the Garden of Eden, that humankind must fall upward into unity with God, because the initial state that we're in paradise is unthinking and unreflective. So it requires the fall upward to return to God, but in a state of unity with self-reflection and wisdom. So this idea that Hegel's critique of Boma is that it's confined to the hard knot of the senses. McGee also ends the chapter saying that Hegel, like I think pretty likely, rejected the sensuous manner in which Boma wrote and spoke, but accepted the core teachings and the core ideas. Hegel's whole project is to try to move from the senses into the contemplation of like the absolute idea as these like formal logical structures that are part of, I think, the sort of perennial philosophy and what Hegel is trying to do that's different and maybe unique is this idea of getting out of the senses to understand it as these like pure, whatever you want to call it, the idea, and how that looks, and to sort of contemplate it and know itself, like know the categories and the concepts and the forms are actually all part of this as well. That's actually the end of my notes, y'all. So I don't know if anyone has final wrap-ups.
I don't have much. Maybe somebody else does, but I was thinking about this figure Bader, who I guess is regarded at the time as Bohm's principal interpreter and also a devout Catholic. What's really interesting to me is not just that Hegel was such an avid reader and was like consciously tried to reconcile their positions in dialogue with Bader and was rejected by him, but also that Bader is I think looks like he fits somewhat in the tradition of what Marx and Engels would have called reactionary socialism. He's like an anti-egalitarian but anti-capitalist, who saw the sort of envisioned a kind of a state more like medieval Christendom, but with this explicit goals of kind of communal society. And the fact that Hegel identified so closely with this proto-socialistic figure, or this, quasi-socialistic figure, is just interesting to me, considering, Hegel's linkage to a much better socialism via Marx later on. It's almost as if, we're just circulating around the absolute and having different aspects of it revealed to us in our contemplation.
Damn. Something about this, I don't know if this even fits anywhere in the discussion at all, but I just wanted to make this point that I've been thinking about after engaging with this. I've noticed that, at the time, Hegel and Schopenhauer were two, probably the most prominent German philosophers at the time. Schopenhauer fucking hated Hegel because Hegel was popular and Schopenhauer wanted to be, and he wasn't.
It was the classic, like, Chad, virgin
totally, absolutely. Yeah. Except for Schopenhauer he hired a lot of prostitutes.
Spiritual virgin.
Yeah. Anyway, so Hegel was mining the mystical Western tradition, whereas what Schopenhauer did was he sort of turned away from the Western tradition and started drawing in from the Eastern mystical traditions, and that's that's how we were sort of bequeathed these two like lineages in the West from Hegel and Schopenhauer. I thought that was really interesting to sort of notice this. Oh, and I was also going to say, I also read Heidegger, and Nietzsche is an arch reactionary. I read Nietzsche, and I think he's very useful as well. Kant was a prominent thinker in an age of colonialism. I still think that he's an important and useful thinker. There's lots of thinkers who live in and promote and participate in horribly reactionary structures and systems or whatever. But here we are, Yeah,
it's just like Morrissey and Douglas Pierce.
All your faves are problematic.
It's true.
One only has to say the words, the College of, Chris, how's your German on this? Is that Tübingen?
Tübingen.
All right. So one only has to say the words, College of Tübingen, to grasp what German philosophy is at bottom: a cunning theology. The Swabians are the best liars in Germany. They lie innocently. Friedrich Nietzsche and the Antichrist.
Yeah, this is where Nietzsche is rejecting the theology of German philosophy.
I mean, this is also where Rosicrucianism comes into play as well.
Yeah.
I found it really interesting. First of all, I really appreciate McGee's approach here. It's very systematic, and he does it does a really good job of painting a full picture, because he doesn't start with Hegel's direct relationship to Freemasonry or Rosicrucianism, but rather helps paint the general picture of what it meant in Hegel's lifetime to be an intellectual in the part of Germany that he grew up in, and how important that was. And he said there's no way to know for sure how many of these intellectuals tried to join the order. I guess he's referring to the Rosicrucian order at the time, but that it becomes synonymous with, or at least for a lot of people, being a member of one of these kind of like secret societies that are steeped in the Hermetic tradition is synonymous with being a philosopher and being an important intellectual.
Interesting thing about the Rosicrucians too, and he doesn't mention this in the book, is that there never was actually a Rosicrucian order that anyone knows about, right? There was the initial publications of the Rosicrucian manifestos, and then a bunch of people that self-affiliated as Rosicrucians from there. And that's where we get all of the different competing Rosicrucianisms that exist now and have existed since then. So
that's why I was saying when he says it's unclear how many intellectuals tried to join the order, I was doing that with quotations that no listener can see, right? Yeah. But the implication there is because there wasn't actually one to join, but clearly people were trying to find it to join, kind of like the Illuminati now, only people are not trying to join it so much as trying to find its hand behind every event,
hidden in plain sight, like Beyonce's hand gestures while she's on stage.
It's a demonstration of their power.
Or my initiate tattoo from being in the Illuminati.
Oh, y'all both have it. Nice.
Yeah. Well, because we're both in it.
Yeah, we're both in the Illuminati.
What's the Groucho Marx quote? I would never be a part of a club that would have me as a member.
Yeah, well, I probably wouldn't have been in a club that would have him as a member either. So the fact that Pope Clement the 12th excommunicates all Masons from the Catholic Church in the 1730s, it just helps sort of round out the picture of the influence of what some people at the time called the Second Reformation, where like the broad universalism of Christianity has already gone through its one Reformation, and so now there are like Protestants of all kinds, and Lutheran Germany is then experiencing internal to that another Reformation, and it's at least deemed threatening by the Catholic Church enough to have to excommunicate people.
I mean, it was a hotbed of Jacobin thought and republicanism in the more progressive Masonic lodges, and of course they're Universalists. So that's always the thing that the church didn't like back then.
Yeah, well, and the fact that like when the French Revolution breaks out, that Hegel plants the Liberty Tree. That's not just because he's caught up in the spirit of the age, like most young radicals would have been at the time, but also because he sees it as the coming to being. What does he call it? The consummation of the era of freedom. And he says it's like he's lucky enough to have been alive in the era of the consummation of freedom. And I would contend that we exist in that same era. It's not like some people say that Hegel reconciles himself with the conservative post-Napoleonic order. It's like, oh, this is the end of history. But I think that requires a willful ignorance on the part of A, Hegel's philosophy, and B, the scope of history itself. We're not in a period that is post the French Revolution yet. We're in the period birthed by the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Well, also Hegel in the philosophy of history ends by saying, yes, it was embodied in the Prussian state at that moment, but then was also looking to the young United States and the colonies at that point as well as the next phase.
And Russia.
Yeah, and he describes his ideal state as one with all sorts of things that don't exist in the Prussian monarchy, like for one, trial by jury of your peers. Anyways, so looking through this chapter, the thing that I thought was most interesting was the treatment of Goethe through the Goethe's familiarity with alchemy and his early alchemical experiments, in not in the sense of the way that not the spiritual alchemy that is of his later years, but the physical alchemy that he had a lab, which I just think is cool. I didn't know that about Goethe. And also the other thing is this is just something I want to ask people if they know anything about Swabian piety and the Swabian kind of inside of German Protestantism. Because
You mean the pietist movements?
Yeah, I just don't know anything about that. Maybe somebody could give an exposition.
Well, I mean, the pietists were attempting to center religion on the person, sort of like de-emphasize the liturgical nature of mainstream Lutheranism and put a lot of emphasis on practice, practice religion and the living a just, upright, and moral life as a method of getting closer to God. But within that is an intense mysticism. So
Yes.
it's sort of like the way we were raised, Jason, but with mysticism.
The way we were raised with the mysticism with which we were raised, but with a full appreciation of what it is.
Yeah.
Yes, the pietists during this time was also the distinction between that a lot of Protestants have, like Lutheran or Catholic or Orthodox, but between the state and the church does not exist. Within the pietist movements of this time, the role of the state was to eliminate sin, basically. So you came up with all these really weird religious laws, and one way to engage with God as a society was this long catalog thing that the dress should be this and this long, and your hair should be this and this long, and so on and so forth, and that should be enforced by the local prince, or by a prophet, more generally.
Yeah.
So it was also it often took millenarian expressions within politics, but quite reactionary millenarian movements.
Okay.
I want to quote a quick line in here that I just think connects up the Swabians and Hegel's work and how we're part of this tradition. Reserved and uncommunicative, they conceal deep within themselves a quiet faculty for brooding and meditating.
Hey, I've got those faculties.
Hey, man.
Goth as fuck.
This is also the period in Hegel's life where he begins his studies properly and where his roommate is... I didn't realize that he and Schelling were roommates, which is just really cool. And speaking of quotes, I really like this line in a letter to Schelling. He says that reason and freedom are watchword and our rallying point, the invisible church. And it just, you really have to try hard not to uncover and appreciate the constant references that Hegel makes in his own personal life to, this world of mysticism that is so embarrassing and unfortunate for everybody who wants Hegel to just be Kant, but harder to understand.
So the invisible church thing is worth touching on because I think that shows up first in Boma, and is what in this time, in Hegel's time, is what the Freemasons refer to themselves as. And so there's no evidence of him ever having been a Freemason, but he uses Masonic language constantly and in private letters talks as though he is a Mason. So if he's not a Mason, he's definitely familiar with Freemasonry and aping a lot of its terminology. And there's even a point in his letters to Schelling where he talks about their group as its own sort of like Masonic body.
So one other thing I want to touch on that actually kind of relates to us talking about drugs and meditation is the connection to the Eleusinian mysteries and how for Hegel and like Hölderlin, like talking, Hegel wrote Eleusis for him. So I was curious what y'all know about the Eleusinian mysteries and how that like relates to Masonry.
Well, I know that the Masons attempt to recreate a Christianized version of the Eleusinian mysteries in their rituals, and that it was a Greek mystery school. That's really it.
And I think a lot of the work around it is that the mysteries were basically usually, I think, around like harvest, but you would basically drink what was called the kykeon and you would go into a cave and like the mysteries would be revealed to you. And there's a lot of sort of research that shows it was probably some sort of like LSD, like, analog that you were drinking in the Kaikion, and you would basically get this mystical vision. And it was something that was accessible to everyone in society that one time of the year. But the idea that the Eleusinian mysteries then became part of Masonry, and like Hegel is referencing it, I think is just completely fascinating.
Yeah.
I just want to go on to the Invisible Church a bit quicker. It is a much older concept than Boma. It appears in the early Apostolic Church Fathers, but with another meaning.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about this meaning specifically. Like,
yeah.
But I'm familiar with what you're talking about as well. Yeah.
So for this meaning, like, is the invisible church then like where it's the divine in the hearts of men? Is that how it gets defined in this conception?
In this conception, it's opposed to the visible church being like the the church as it exists, your Lutheran whatever churches, and the community of Christians in Christendom specifically. That's the visible church, right? The invisible church would be those with esoteric knowledge, right? Those who have received gnosis, in this specific meaning, right? And then, of course, Masons at the time would have thought of themselves as having been these people that have achieved gnosis by going through their like degrees and everything like that.
Yeah, it's sort of like how there is a thing we call the left or the socialist movement around the world. And that would be the visible church. But then there are listeners of the Regrettable Century. And
the real
that's what we would call the invisible church. I thought it was really great that Hegel's was an enthusiastic reader of the journal called Minerva, which was quasi-Masonic, the way it's described, but also like dedicated itself to disseminating the radical thought of the French Jacobins.
Read the tagline on it on the front of the magazine. Do you have that handy?
So on the cover of the journal is the owl of Minerva flying over some Greek columns, next to which stands a child holding a trowel, and in the shade of a tree is a woman surrounded by her children. Next to her is a shield on which the head